my pleasure to introduce Katherine Spoonamore, who has been a cardiovascular genetic counselor for 10 years in Indiana. 3 months ago, she joined Invitae, one of the large genetic testing companies. And I want to invite everyone to check out Katie's bio in Whova for some very fun facts about her. I loved reading about you, Katie. So I will ask you to go ahead and share your screen. And you may begin and unmute yourself.
All right.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Marsha, and all of SADS for including me in today's conference. I'm happy to talk with everyone about why should everyone see a genetic counselor. And there have been some interesting discussions and questions about genetic testing and the genetic aspects of SADS diagnoses already today. So I'm hoping that I can kind of give us a shared basis of understanding, and then would love to have a good discussion and see what questions everyone has still about these topics. So quick background and disclosures for me. So as Marsha said, I previously worked as a genetic counselor providing clinical care to families in cardiology in an academic medical center here in Indiana, where I live. And I am currently employed by Invitae in a non-clinical role, but still working on increasing access, awareness, and utilization of genetic testing for cardiac conditions. And the views expressed here today are my own and do not reflect that of my employer or my previous employer or anyone else, and they're not intended as medical advice. So with that said, our roadmap for discussion today is to review a few basic genetic concepts about SADS diagnoses. Again, just to make sure we have kind of we're all starting on the same page together. Review a little bit of information about genetic testing and things that are smooth and historically have been less smooth about it. Go through what a genetic counselor is and how genetic counselors can have an impact specifically on having family-based care for these conditions. So without further ado, we'll talk about the genetic aspects of SADS, which are primarily, we're talking about inherited arrhythmias and cardiomyopathy conditions with arrhythmic risk. And in general, we have 2 copies of most of our genes, 1 copy inherited from mom, 1 inherited from dad. And whatever this gene is, that's the cause of your SADS condition. Usually these conditions are inherited such that there's 1 difference in 1 copy of the gene, either from mom or dad or brand new in you. And therefore we've got a 50-50 chance of passing on that risk factor with each pregnancy, which essentially means that for a person with one of these diagnoses, long QT, CPVT, Brugada, ARVC, there's a 50-50 chance for each of their closest biological relatives, so parents, brothers and sisters, and children, to also have that genetic risk factor. And for most of these conditions, here, they can look really different from person to person, even within the same family. It's not just you either don't have the risk factor and you're uninfected, meaning you don't have the heart problem, or you do have the genetic risk factor and you definitely have the heart problem 100% of the time, and it looks exactly the same in everyone in the family. In fact, not everyone with the genetic risk factor for many of these diagnoses actually develops the condition. Some do, some do not. And of those who do have the genetic risk factor and develop the condition, they can develop it at different ages and with very different severity and maybe different primary clinical features. So maybe one person has a certain type of arrhythmia, another person has slightly different experience with arrhythmia. One needs a device, one does not need a device, etc. And with these conditions, we actually have both of those things happening most of the time. So we have both. Not everyone with the risk factor will develop the condition, and those who do will develop it at different ages and stages, and it will look different for all of them. So what does this actually look like? What does this mean for one individual with long QT syndrome or CPVT or ARVC or Brugada, et cetera, and their closest family members? So if we have one person in a family here, this is a pedigree drawing family history, something most of you are probably familiar with. The person here shaded in blue would be representing the person with the diagnosis. Their closest family members, so their children down here, their brother or sisters, and their parents would each have a 50% chance to have that same genetic risk factor. So these individuals, according to published guidelines, would need their hearts checked on a regular basis to look for any concerning signs of arrhythmia or cardiomyopathy developing to provide us that opportunity for preventative care. And if we can find the specific underlying genetic cause with genetic testing, then that person's long QT syndrome, CPVT, Brugada, et cetera, if we know that risk factor, then we can do testing for just that risk factor for all of those at-risk family members and take away some of that uncertainty by clarifying who really has that risk factor and really needs that screening and ongoing cardiac care, and who maybe doesn't have that risk factor. And this is one thing in life that they can check off their list of things that they need to have ongoing concern for. And although we've narrowed it down to who needs that screening, it is important to note that these at-risk family members still have some uncertainty, and they need to have their hearts looked at on a repeat ongoing basis because they may or may not develop the heart problem themselves. And if they do, it could be at any age. And the presenting feature or finding or symptom for many of these conditions, as we all know with SADS, can be a tragic, unexpected sudden death. So having those ongoing screenings is a really important part of care. And it also clues us into the next kind of cascade group of family members who would be at risk and who should be evaluated. So really just allows us to take care of the whole family step by step. So what do we know about the genes involved and what do we not know? In general, for these conditions, we know that several different genes can cause the same condition. So if you're looking at genes that cause long QT syndrome, there are several of them. If you look at genes that cause ARVC, there are several of them, et cetera. We also know that more than one gene can contribute to the condition in any one person, although this probably happens significantly less often than we thought years ago. We also know that there's significant overlap of the genes involved in the different conditions. So some genes can cause multiple different diagnoses, and one diagnosis can be caused by many different genes as well. And this has been even more clear as we've done broader testing of many genes, and that is actually usually more helpful than testing one or two genes at a time when we're trying to find the underlying cause. We also know that we don't know every gene involved with any one condition. So the detection rate or the likelihood that we find a definite explanation for an underlying cause for a specific diagnosis varies based on what that diagnosis is and every person's individual history, personal history, family history scenarios. But in general, there are always going to be people who we know clinically have these things, but with the available genetic testing, we're unable to pinpoint the specific genetic cause today. So genetic testing can be a bit complicated and it doesn't always give us an answer. So why is it helpful and why would we do it? I think one reason that is not to be underappreciated is that when it pinpoints a specific underlying cause, it can offer an explanation and can contribute to answering the why question. Why did this happen? Why is this happening? What's going on here? And that in itself can help families, I think, understand, cope, move forward, deal with things. It can also direct medical treatment and can make, it can be a part of the puzzle that clarifies diagnosis and exactly what is the underlying cause of the arrhythmias that have been observed. It can have prognostic value and give us an idea of specific scenarios or situations that might be more likely to trigger an arrhythmia, and also predict therapy response in some situations. And beyond the individual patient care, it can direct relatives care, like we talked about earlier, clarifying who's at risk and who's not at risk. And ultimately, genetic testing with that cardiac screening, looking at family members' hearts on a regular basis to figure out who we need to be taking care of and preventing dangerous arrhythmias for saves lives, which is the goal. So historically, at least, why have people maybe not done genetic testing, or what have been problems with it? One common question that we still get is, isn't it really expensive? Certainly genetic testing was cost prohibitive for many families years ago, and that has changed dramatically, which I think Dr. Landstrom talked about earlier today already. Not only has technology improved and the cost has dropped significantly, insurance coverage has improved, so this is more likely to be paid for. There are also a fair number of what they call sponsored testing programs, where there are partnerships established between the genetic testing laboratories and pharma companies and other patient advocacy organizations to pay for the genetic testing for people who meet certain criteria. There are also programs in place with laboratories that allow no additional charge for family member cascade testing whenever a genetic cause of the heart problem is found in the family, which really reduces barriers and increases access to testing. And the self-pay price of these tests has dropped significantly and is available for most tests now as low as $200 or $250, which is a stark contrast to whenever people thought it was 100% going to cost them thousands of dollars and be not possible. That's not the case anymore. It's usually attainable. What if the person with the condition is deceased? So when we start genetic testing, we want to start that testing in the person, in the family, with the arrhythmia. And sometimes, tragically, that person isn't around for testing, and that has been, that was where it stopped. Occasionally, postmortem testing was able to be completed, but that was a big struggle. And although much of that work, there is still certainly work to be done there, I would say that the diligent work of the SADS organization and others, and recommendations from the National Association for Medical Examiners to save a sample appropriate for genetic testing in cases of young unexplained sudden death and other developments means that it's much more likely that this process can be successful whenever the person in the family who needs testing has passed away. More likely to be a sample, more able to obtain that sample and complete the testing at a reasonable cost. And this is happening much more frequently and much more smoothly than it was 5 years ago, and certainly more than 10 years ago. And then what about inconclusive results? So we can do the testing. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's inconclusive. And there have already been several questions today about these variants of uncertain significance. So what do we do with those? And I would say that with the right team and with the right plan, we can handle these. And this is not a reason to avoid genetic information. So when we think about how genetic testing works, basically it's like spell check on a computer. So the test is going to read these genes letter by letter, just like spell check, looking for some small spelling difference that could change the way that gene works and lead to a problem causing these heart problems. So one possible result is a pathogenic or a likely pathogenic variant, which means this is a difference, this is a change, this is a variation from what we expected to see. And it's definitely a problem. We have enough information to say that where this changes, the type of change it is, where we've seen it before, all of these things, this is a problem and this is it. And that's the reason why we do the testing, to give us clarification and a path forward for not only the patient, but the family members. That doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes we look at all the genes we know to look about today and read them letter by letter very carefully. And as far as we can tell, they all look just the way they should. We don't find anything unusual, find no changes at all, or some little change that we know is benign. It's not even going to be included on the report most of the time. And that's a negative result. And then this third possible outcome, which is a variant of inconclusive or uncertain significance. And this is a change where we say, hey, there's something different here. This isn't exactly what we expected to see, but we don't have enough information at this point to say for sure, is this a problem or is this not a problem? Does this make a difference or not? If we don't have enough information to say it's definitely a problem or it's definitely not a problem, it gets listed there as, we don't know. We saw this difference and we can't say for sure. Of course, we learn more over time and we reclassify, but I think it's important to remember, why did we do the test in the first place? The test was done in someone with a heart problem to try to pinpoint the cause of that heart problem. And when you find a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant, you've found it. That's the cause. So now we can use that. And we can say who else in the family needs to be tested and have care. We can add that information to all of the other pieces of information from the cardiology team about how to move forward, making care decisions related to treatment, et cetera. And if we didn't find a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant, then we didn't find it. So we need to learn more. We need to know about more genes. We need to know about more changes in more genes. And in the meantime, the plan is screen family members with heart evaluations, not genetic testing, because we didn't find what we were looking for. So we don't know exactly what to go looking for in family members from a genetic testing standpoint, but we still know how to look at people's hearts. Not me, I'm a genetic counselor, but the cardiologists still know how to look at people's hearts, and they can look for signs of arrhythmia and arrhythmia risk and cardiomyopathy and risk for those things. And we can monitor those over time and still take care of families really effectively, even when genetic testing results are uninformative. And again, I think that with the right team and the skillful genetic test interpretation, which is really important, we can handle these results, however they shake out, and make the best plan to care for your family. So what's a genetic counselor? Basically, it's someone who's going to make all that information that we just talked about useful to you and your family. So genetic counselors practice genetic counseling, which is, by definition, the process of helping people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of genetic contributions to disease. And the process integrates interpretation of family and medical histories to assess the chance of disease occurrence or recurrence, education about inheritance, testing, management, prevention, resources, and research, and counseling to promote informed choices and adaptation to the risk or condition. And ultimately, we work as members of the healthcare team in these situations. And typically, an encounter with a genetic counselor is going to focus on collecting and assessing your family history information, drawing those pictures or analyzing those pictures that I showed earlier of a family history with circles and squares and lines and all of that. Identifying the best person in the family to do genetic testing with. We want to start with the right person who's going to give us the best chance of getting the most useful information from that genetic testing. And then also picking the best test for that individual person and family. And then navigating the testing logistics, which often are very simple. Cheek swab or spit in a tube, send it in, and then you get your results. Sometimes the logistics are very simple. For postmortem cases, they can be a bit more challenging, coordinating who has the sample. Is there a sample? What's the state of the sample? Will it be accepted by the laboratory? What do we need to do that? Who's going to pay for it, et cetera? So navigating that process and then interpreting those results and saying, did we find it or did we not find it? And if there's some sort of inconclusive nature of the differences that were found, working through what we know about them, what we don't know about them, and what do we actually do with them moving forward, applying them to the plan for your entire family's care. Which brings me to the next point, that genetic counselors are really trained and prioritize extending care beyond the patient to the entire family. And we know that that has several different aspects involved that can involve a lot of coordination and a lot of communication. So facilitating education and information sharing with at-risk relatives, which could be anywhere. Sometimes that information is difficult to communicate. And sometimes communication within the family is difficult already. So having someone to kind of brainstorm, how do you share this information in general? And how do you share it with people who maybe already have strained relationships or distance or whatever? Genetic counselors can partner with you to do that effectively. and connect family members with resources for cascade genetic testing and cardiac screening. You had testing with your doctor at this laboratory, but your relatives live in a totally different state or a totally different country. And how are they going to take the information from your test and turn it into an opportunity for them to have testing or the right type of cardiac screening based on your results of evaluation? Because that matters. And also connecting both patients and family members with additional psychological support, grief and coping resources when necessary. Often genetic counselors have 1, 2, maybe 3 interactions with the family, but are less involved on a regular basis for the entire duration of their care, although it kind of depends on the setup. But certainly genetic counselors can help identify when there would be a need or a benefit to connect with additional resources in that realm and help to do that as well. So in general, genetic testing information can be very helpful for families, for medical care, for family screening, etc. And genetic counselors are there to partner with you, your cardiology team, to make sure that it's the most helpful that it can be, that we're doing it in the most helpful way with the most helpful people, and that we're interpreting the results in the most accurate way, and whether they're informative or not, applying them to the plan of care for your family with the rest of the pieces of the puzzle. So if I've convinced you and you're thinking, well, how in the world would I find a genetic counselor? Initially, I would start with asking your doctor. Sometimes genetic counselors are embedded in cardiology clinics or in genetics clinics that are involved with the cardiology office that you attend. Sometimes there isn't someone local, but you can always start with having that conversation. There's a National Society of Genetic Counselors searchable database at findageneticcounselor.com, where you can look up your geographical location and genetic counselors who specialize in cardiovascular genetics and identify if there's someone near you that you maybe just weren't aware of. There are also several telehealth genetic counseling companies that specialize in providing genetic counseling services over telemedicine, video visits, telephone visits, and have genetic counselors licensed everywhere they need to be licensed, and have genetic counselors who specialize in different areas, including cardiovascular genetics. So that could be a good accessible option as well. And the testing companies that actually complete the testing, the laboratories, often also have some amount of genetic counseling resources to go with those. So that could be an option worth exploring. And SADS is a great network full of resources, and also have resources on genetics providers in addition to cardiology providers across the country and the world, depending on who you ask. They're a great source of being connected in this area. So that's mostly what I wanted to make sure that we were on the same page about. I'm hoping that you have some great questions and we can have a good discussion, but I really appreciate your time and the invitation to be part of the conference today.
That was awesome, Katie. Thank you so much. We do have 8 questions that have been 9 now that have been posted. So let's get started.
Let's do it.
What do you tell patients who have VUS variant?
So mostly I would say, going back to this, the reason that we did the test was to see if we could pinpoint the specific underlying cause. And if we have a VUS, that's inconclusive. We don't know if that's the cause or not, which means for now, it's not the cause. So we're going to have to make a plan for the family as if we don't know the cause, because we don't. I think it's important to be reassuring that we can still take care of family members. We can still be very conservative and make sure that people are getting screened, and we can prevent bad things like that. But ultimately, there's a lot that we need to learn. And some of it is figuring out, is this one change in this one gene a problem, yes or no? There's a lot of progress being made in that area with a lot of different tools, like Dr. Landstrom was talking about earlier. To be perfectly honest, as a trend, what we're seeing is that most of those inconclusive variants end up being unexciting. Not always, but most of the time. So try not to get too excited about them on the front end in general. And I think also just more gene discovery. I think it's more likely that we are going to find additional genes or polygenic risk scores and things like that, other answers to explain some of these things than, oh, this inconclusive variant that we thought was nothing is actually something in the long run.
Okay, thank you. Does Invitae do any research when it comes to variants of unknown significance? And if so, how can one participate?
That's a good question. I don't know that I'm the best person to answer it, actually. There is always a huge effort going on to reduce variants of uncertain significance. Everyone involved in the process wants to know for sure whether a gene change is important or not. Everyone wants to know that from the moment it's identified. And so there's a lot of work going into that. And there are a lot of different ways to approach that problem. And I know that efforts within Invitae and other labs are working on that problem from a whole bunch of different aspects, including lots of different ways to use AI and protein modeling and different things like Dr. Landstrom talked about earlier, and also some different in vitro and actual assay systems, I think, which was asked about with iPS cells and other things earlier. There's all sorts of research going on, and in general, being tested and consenting to any process that people are asking you about sharing that information so that we can aggregate the data for that AI learning and all of that is really helpful, and the best way to process to participate, really.
Okay. Thank you. Is saliva genetic testing enough for SADS? Her current diagnosis is long QT, but it came back no genetic marker.
So that's a good question. So actually, the SADS website has a lot of great information about genetic testing basics from a logistical standpoint. And most genetic testing, the samples accepted from different laboratories vary, but blood works great, saliva works great, cheek swabs work great. Usually all of those are options depending on the laboratory. But the accuracy of the testing with those different sample types is the same. The DNA is the same, the accuracy is the same. The only problem that sometimes comes up is if there's a problem with the sample quality and we can't get enough high quality DNA out of the sample to finish the testing. And that happens a hair more often with saliva and cheek swab samples than with blood specimens, just because there's a lot more DNA in blood. And so there's more to work with from the beginning. But usually saliva and buccal are more than sufficient, the cheek swabs. And if they are not sufficient, then they won't finish the test. They'll say, we didn't have enough DNA to finish the test, so we're going to need another sample. If the test was able to be completed, then you can trust that the accuracy of that should be sufficient.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the criteria for assessing mutations and deciding if they are pathogenic or are downgraded to a VUS, especially in a rarer unstudied genes like KCNE1 for long QT type 5?
So there's a lot of them. I have a image here. Let me see if I can share my screen again. Let me pick the right one and then share my screen again with you. There is an organization called the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics that put out standards for how to interpret variants. And I think it's important to note that the first version of these standards wasn't even available or a thing officially until just a few years ago. So if you had testing 10 years ago, there were very few standard guidelines that laboratories were following that ensured that they agreed with how they were classifying a variant. Now we have some guidance, but these rules, even though this chart is not meant to be read specifically, but mostly just to tell you, like, there's a lot of different categories of evidence and a lot of different strengths of evidence. Categories are this way, actually. Strength of evidence is this way. That are evaluated in that process. So there's population data, there's computational and predictive data, there's functional data, segregation data, de novo data, allelic data, lots of other data. And within each of those categories, there's a bunch of different ways that we can get data. And so this framework is actually needs to be broken down into essentially like hundreds of tiny little rules and questions to be answered along the way to decide. And it's harder to get enough evidence to say for sure that something is the cause, the more rare it is. That's just how it is, because we have less data to go into most of these categories. So there are rules that are standard that most laboratories are following if they're CLIA CAP certified, which all of the laboratories that SADS would direct you to are. And there's still some variability within them in how they apply these rules, because there is some subjectivity to them, but it is so much better than it was years ago. And the threshold for saying for sure, yes, this is the cause is high for a reason, because the stakes are high and we don't want to get it wrong, right? So if we say, this is it, this is the cause, and then we test your family member and they don't have it, and we say, oh, they're off the hook, and we're wrong, and something tragic happens later, that's horrible. That's horrible. That's a preventable tragedy, and that's a misuse of this information. And ultimately, that's why the threshold needs to be as high as it is, although it's incredibly frustrating when you're in that inconclusive realm and you want to know, is this it or not? We can't say for sure until we can say for sure, and we don't want to get it wrong.
Thank you. Okay, what would you tell people who have been told to keep testing due to a VUS, but insurance likes to reject the genetic testing costs, let alone the reoccurring testing? Can you get a testing membership or something?
That's a good idea. That's a tough situation. I think it depends on the individual situation. So touching base with a genetic counselor for a one-on-one discussion would be really helpful. But sometimes there really isn't, it's really not useful to continue retesting, because we haven't changed anything since the last time you had testing enough to make it worth redoing. Sometimes it is worth redoing, and then there may or may not be a sponsored testing program that you qualify for or something like that that would allow testing to be done. But it really kind of depends. In the future, I think we all are hoping that we'll move toward something like whole genome testing, where we'll get all the information once, and then we'll use that information in different ways as we learn how to use it in different ways. And it's helpful. We're not there yet, but that would be your genetic testing membership sort of thing, is you have your genome sequenced, and then when you're 5 and you need to know certain things, you get certain information. When you're 12 and you need to know certain things, you get certain information, and throughout the lifespan. But for now, genetic testing is a little more disposable than that, I guess.
Okay. Have you seen any successful approaches to resistance in siblings who should be screened? Facts and information haven't seemed to make a difference. And this is from Melanie. Your thoughts?
That's really tough. You know them better than we do. And so usually it's a matter of having a conversation with what's been helpful with other things in your relationship and in your life, and how can we build on that. But ultimately, you know, people are individuals and they're going to make the decisions that they're going to make. And we only have so much control over that. Making sure that one person's lack of interest in seeking care and screening or testing doesn't impact other people not being able to get care is an important piece, I think, too. So if someone is at risk and they themselves aren't interested in screening, but have children who should be screened for one reason or another, trying to encourage them to at least get their kids screened can be helpful. And kind of not letting that decision to not act spread throughout the family.
Very good. I have zero family history of sudden cardiac arrest or Brugada. I recently discovered that I've inherited one VUS on my SCN5A gene from my father and one from my mother. Because my VUSs are on opposite sides and there is no family history, is it possible that my Brugada syndrome is unique to me because of the combination of these two faulty or not fully functioning genes? From Rachel.
You have a fabulous understanding of genetics. That's a wonderful question. It is certainly possible. I would say, based on what we know about Brugada syndrome and SCN5A, and more than what we know, what we don't know about Brugada syndrome and SCN5A, it's probably not super highly likely, but it's certainly possible. And so I think that harkens back to a good evaluation with expert electrophysiologists who work with Brugada syndrome and know a lot about the field. And is the clinical diagnosis the right clinical diagnosis? And how do we move forward with that? Which I know is something that's been said several times earlier today. And I would answer that way much more than anyone else because I'm not a physician. So those are, I think, questions that are going to be really hard to parse out on a genetic basis until we have more data about those variants. But clinically, the questions can be handled by the electrophysiologists.
Very good. Thank you. Awesome responses, Katie, and presentation. We appreciate all your help in educating our families. And so I think we now have our volunteers online, so we'll move to the next one. So thank you so much, Katie. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.